The second lesson is taken from the Gospel of Matthew, the 6th chapter and the 10th chapter. No one can be a servant of two masters. He will hate one and love the other. He will be loyal to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. This is why I tell you, do not be anxious about the food and drink you need in order to stay alive, or about clothes for your body. After all, isn't life more than food, and isn't the body more than clothes? Aren't you worth much more than the birds? Whoever loves his father and mother more than me is not fit to be my disciple. Whoever loves his son or daughter more than me is not fit to be my disciple. Whoever does not take up his cross and follow in my steps is not fit to be my disciple. For whoever tries to secure his life in this world will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Let us bow together for prayer. Grant, O God, grant some moments apart where we may shake loose from the attitudes that bombard us day in and day out, in the words of the world, that we may discover a new vision of life and a new strength and courage to live it. In the Spirit of Jesus, Amen. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Have you ever wondered, when the third graders stand there in June, what on earth they think they are saying, how they understand that, what they think it means, let alone the rest of the commandments, I suppose? How did you understand it when you were their age? Family down in Texas was startled when their daughter told them that several girls in her class were committing adultery. What makes you say that? Her mother asked, somewhat anxiously. Because they're all painting their nails and wearing makeup and trying to look like adults, she explained. Then there's the mother in Colonia, New Jersey, who listened proudly as her 7-year-old son recited all 10. But she began to suspect that he really didn't understand what they meant when he came to the 10th and said, "Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife in vain." But how do you understand them, especially that first one? We talk all the time about the importance of the 10 Commandments. Down in Mississippi, they even want to put them up on the schoolroom walls. So let's start with the first one. Must be the most important one, that's why it's first. No other gods. Seems to me that many of us in this secular age have enough trouble believing in one, let alone others. They say that at Harvard Divinity School, they believe in at most one God. Is this some antiquated agenda from the superstitious days of polytheism, some hangover from the infancy of the race? You know, where the natives saw a god behind every bush or in every tree. I'd like to try this morning for a moment to rehabilitate the first commandment, because I think it goes to the very heart of life, to the very heart of the most critical problem we face as human beings. Get this one right, and I think you're halfway there, maybe more than halfway. The first and continual failure, argues this old story, is the rather pervasive and continual violation on all our parts of this command. That's why it's there. Because we all have many gods. Well, we may argue theoretically about whether God exists or not, but have you ever noticed how little interest the Bible or Jesus even shows in that question? Because practically, we're all polytheists. We all have many gods. Chad Walsh, professor up at Beloit College, wrote a little book many years ago called Campus Gods on Trial, in which he argued that it's nonsense to say that the modern university is godless. He says the gods of the university culture bump into you all over the place. And I want to suggest this morning we all have many gods because we all have many fears. So point number one this morning is this: anxiety is the human problem. As human beings, we are limited and vulnerable. More than that, We know we are. We know that our existence is threatened by all sorts of things. We know that life is precarious, at least when we've matured and start falling downstairs, we know this. I'm not all that too sure about the young people. Actually, they know it as well. For all of us, you see, life means more than just physical survival, getting on. Life means acceptance and applause. It means purpose and popularity. And if any of these things are threatened, our life is threatened. We become anxious. That's why young people who've lost any of these dimensions of life may decide to end their physical existence as well. And I'm really convinced that at bottom, anxiety is the fundamental problem we all face. At least Jesus seems to put his finger on it again and again. I resonate to the experience of Basil King. He writes, "When I say that during most of my conscious life I've been the prey of fears, I take it for granted that I'm expressing the case for the majority of people. I cannot remember a time when some dread of one kind or another was not in the air. In childhood, it was the fear of going to bed. Later, it was the fear of school, the first contact of the tender little soul with life's crudeness. Later still, there was the experience which all of us know of waking up in the morning with a feeling of dread at what we have to do that day. Fear dogs us, each one of us, in one way or another, but everyone in some way. The mother is afraid for her children, the father is afraid for his business, the executive is afraid for his job. There's not a home or an office or a factory or church or school in which some hang-dog apprehension is not eating at the hearts of men, women, and children who go in and out. We don't always see it in other people because most of us have learned to put up a good front. A friend says to Charlie Brown, "I kind of admire you, Charlie Brown. You always seem so calm. Are you really that calm all the time?" And Charlie answers, "Well, let me put it this way. I'm the only calm person I know who's a nervous wreck." And we don't always detect it in ourselves, given the way our parents raised us and our capacity for denial, until it emerges as a sleep disorder or a dysfunctional marriage or an alcohol problem. But it's there. It's lurking in the cellars of our mind, waiting to work its mischief. Now, you'll all be glad to know, if you're like me, that anxiety is not a sin. Nothing to feel guilty about. It's simply the human condition. It's the condition of people who are vulnerable and helpless before so many life-threatening factors and forces over which we really don't have any control. Point one, anxiety is the fundamental human problem. Point two, we seek an answer to our anxieties in false gods. As false as the gods that Joshua is challenging his people about long ago. The fundamental sin, if you will, failure, whatever you want to call it, lies in how we deal with our apprehensions. The gods we turn to assuage our anxiety and somehow save our lives. For the Bible, for Jesus, the essence of sin and failure lies not in the deliberate choice of evil. It lies in the elevation to a level of dominance in our lives of some good thing as an answer to all our anxiety, which is called idolatry. For the people of Joshua's day, it was devotion to the powers of fertility. I think it's almost impossible for us to imagine what it must be like to live from hand to mouth, from season to season, hoping desperately, anxiously, that we can win enough grain from the ground to survive for one more year. What were they anxious about in that day? Empty bellies. And what did they turn to? They turned to fertility cults that ignored faithfulness and discipline for all kinds of magical and sensual practices that they thought promised to generate grain and goats and children. They bowed down before a perfectly good thing, the powers of nature, and gave it their trust and obedience. Now, of course, that kind of idolatry is passé. Nobody in this room is really tempted in that direction this morning, unless you're a subject of High Priest Hugh Hefner, which is why Jesus updated the first commandment by identifying the false gods of his day, the created powers of the first century that tempted. tempted people to still their anxiety and save their lives by worshiping them. And he lifts up one, interestingly enough, again and again. You cannot serve both God and money. Sounds like an old preacher's harangue, doesn't it? But again and again, in subtle ways, we attempted to try. We turned to money as more than just a medium of exchange. We turned to it to still the primal anxieties about our future, about our importance, about our purpose. Money in and of itself is morally neutral. The biblical word is not, money is the root of all evil. The biblical word is passion for money is the root of all evil. We use money for all kinds of good things. The sin is in seeking through money to somehow secure our life, all of it, our purpose, our significance, our powers against our fear of death and emptiness and insignificance and powerlessness. Then we no longer have money. Money has us, has become our God, that which dominates our thoughts and energy, to which we trust our lives, and which therefore rules us as our master. Now I ask you, is this a danger 2,000 years later? Well, let me read a few words, not from a theologian or preacher, but from a respected businessman, Richard J. Frank, head of the John Levine Company. He says, in a speech of his, the New York Times last spring ran an article entitled "Feeling Poor on $600,000 a Year." The gist was that the young wealthy today have a need for things and services always in excess of their income. The need for success symbols was never to be satisfied at any income level. The fixation on wealth as the primary foundation for life is destructive. Again, he says, a whole generation of bright young people have been seduced. This fixation with money has been narcotic-like in its effect on many of our most talented young people, like a drug. They have needed higher and higher doses for the same thrill. Or there's a story out of Washington not too long ago about Derek Connor, who was a brilliant youth group leader. On July 6th last year, Derek Connor was shot to death in the nation's capital after being enticed into being a drug runner. And the Washington Post reports simply, Derek became mesmerized by materialism. Or there's the United Press Dateline of last July, which says, forget President Bush's inaugural pleas for a kinder and gentler nation. Americans are not about to turn away from preoccupation with material possessions, according to a study released Wednesday. Quote, materialism will continue to be one of the driving forces in American society over the next decade, reports Jacqueline Silver for Spiegel Bates Worldwide. In a clear break with traditional values, consumers are no longer ashamed to admit that their primary goals are to own expensive things and lead luxurious lifestyles. Now, I'm not passing judgment, really. I'm not harping. These people are not blatantly evil. They're in quest of something, some security, some soothing, some ease, some sense of worth to still the apprehension and anxiety of life in the modern world. And consciously or unconsciously, they seem to be seeking an answer in money, in accumulation, in having. Note the language, a driving force, their primary goal. That's the description of a God. It's one of the good gifts of this world elevated to the role of ultimate trust and obedience. Again, another God bidding for allegiance in Jesus' day at least was, did you hear it? The family. You see, that's what Jesus' words are about when he talks about loving me more than son or daughter or father or mother or husband or wife. Hard to imagine your family being a God, your ultimate investment in life. I love the story about a speaker at a government symposium on risk-taking who began by selecting an individual out of the audience and saying, imagine there's a large I-beam, 40 feet long here on the floor in front of this podium. I'll give you $50. Will you walk it? The guy says, of course. Now, said the speaker, suppose I took the same beam and suspended it between two buildings 50 stories above the street. Now I'll give you $50. Will you walk it? And of course the fellow promptly said, no way. Then the speaker said, suppose I'm on the top of one of the buildings and I'm dangling one of your kids over the edge, and you're on the other building, and I shout to you, if you don't walk across that beam and get your kid, I'm going to drop him. Would you then walk the I-beam? And the fellow in the audience hesitated ever so slightly and then replied, Which kid have you got? We all felt that way, you know? Irma Bombeck once said, "I defy any parent who's been on a trip with a child who kicked the seat for 50 miles, threw his shoes out the window, lost his pet snake in Cleveland during the rush hour, and spilled his slush down your back to tell me she's never considered abandoning him at the next Shell station." You know? Family as God. But you know, not one of us can live without some intimacy and purpose. And the absence of intimacy and purpose for our lives evokes all kind of anxiety. And the family does promise to grant these gifts in some measure, and still the fear of life alone and without meaning. So far, so good. But what if our need for relationship and purpose in life becomes focused narrowly on our family? What if we depend upon our children or parents or spouse to take care of it all? What if we expect them to save us in that sense? We place a burden on them that they can't ultimately bear, and they come to anxiously dominate our lives. And there are a lot of other gods out there. I forget who it was who called the goddess of America the bitch goddess success. Fear of failure drives us toward success at any cost sometimes. Isn't that why some insist that their children learn something on Sunday morning out there rather than get a Christian education? What's the message? Who or what is ruling? What really counts? Surveys indicate that 60% of all high school students cheat. Why? They've decided to be bad kids, right? Wrong. Not at all, because the God in that moment that they're trusting their life to, the God without whom they think they cannot truly get on, is called success, demands it. Or there's drugs, alcohol. Why do people turn to alcohol? Is it not to still the storm often? I think that anxiety and the misuse of alcohol are intimately related. And doesn't it come to dominate and dictate as much as any ancient deity in the bush ever did? There's the God of the crowd, the peer group, against the fear of being alone. So many young people are willing to do anything to guarantee and secure the favor and company of the God. The crowd becomes God. That is a good thing elevated to the level of ultimate trust and obedience. Not to mention their parents. Lee Iacocca tells about his early days trying to sell automobiles in the South. Did you know his real name was Lido Iacocca? He says, can you imagine a man with a name like that trying to sell anything in Mississippi or Alabama? So he changed his name to Lee. And then he began to worry about that, become anxious about that. So he turned it around. He became Iacocca Lee, you know, like Robert E. So there are all kinds of gods out there bidding for our trust and obedience, and they're not evil in and of themselves, at least most of them. It's just that they're not up to delivering what we most desperately want and need. You remember when the little dog Toto tips over the screen in The Wizard of Oz? Surely you do. Dorothy and her three little companions see that the wizard is really only a little man. And they've just about risked their lives to obtain the Wicked Witch's broom for the wizard in order to have life. And Dorothy blurts out in anger, "I think you're a very bad man." And the wizard replies, "Oh no, my dear, I'm really a very good man, but I'm a very bad wizard." And that's the way it is with all these things or people. They're very good things and people, but they're very bad gods. And this is my third point. They make very bad gods because, like the wizards, sooner or later they fail you. And in the meantime, they leave you scared because you're never sure whether you can depend upon them to do the job. I shudder when I hear somebody say, his job is his whole life, or her whole life revolves around those two boys. But what happens when the job or the boys are gone? Then it's too late maybe to learn a new God. One physician told me once of a young boy who was brought into the hospital critically injured, and the The father, a man of wealth and power and prominence, arrived shortly thereafter, and as the physician came out after checking the boy, the father said angrily, "Why aren't you doing something? I want the best care that money can buy. I want you to fly him to the best specialists in the country. Do something to save my boy." The physician says he had to turn to the father and say, "There is nothing that I or money can do for your son. All we can do is wait and pray." A man whose trust, I think, was dangerously in the wrong God. Associate Dean at Bethel Seminary up at St. Paul tells about John, active in the church, model young man. One day John's brother gave the dean a cassette tape which contained John's diary. The entries focused on two concerns: his desire for a new job and his desire for Cindy. All he wanted in life was to become an emergency medical technician and to marry Cindy. But he learned that he could not become an EMT one day, and he learned the next day that his girlfriend was dating one of his friends, and devastated, he went out and took his life. Gods that failed, they always do. But as Santayana once said, when the half-gods go, then the real gods arrive. If anxiety is the fundamental problem, if we turn to the gods of this world to still it, if the gods of this world fail us, then perhaps then we're ready for the true God, the God of the commandment, the God of Jesus. You see, that's why in Russia I think they're turning to him. Why? I've seen them, the young people crowding the churches, because the gods of communism, in which many of them once believed with such dedication and fervor and purpose, have failed. I glanced at the New York Times this morning. The week in review has a big headline, "The God That Failed." And they're finding new life in a much older word: do not be anxious, follow me, trust your life to me. These are the only two things any God demands, after all. So for me, you see, life is a kind of struggle. I go through a number of gods any day. It's a struggle, however, to get clear about whom I must really obey and whom I must really trust. And I haven't pulled it off, and neither of you. And at day's end, we go to him for forgiveness, and it's always there, and we get up next day, and we try again. But life is meant to be the movement toward the one true God. We become free of anxiety when we determine to obey, to do the right thing no matter what the consequences are. The first commandment is about the question, who do you finally obey in life? Bert Berube, who worked for the General Services Administration of the government for many years as an engineer, when he was made director of the Office of Systems Acquisition in the Washington office in 1978, he began to be bothered. He saw a lot of waste of public funds, unsafe facilities in construction and maintenance. He began to question. He was demoted. The abuses continued, and Berube continued to complain, and in 1983 he was fired. Although Berube knew that speaking out could hurt his family, he believed that he really had no choice. He writes, "Your conscience is something you deal with yourself. It is not a committee action. It's a question whether you believe it is right or wrong, a question of faith. I am the one who's going to be held responsible by God for what I do in my life. Thou shalt have no other gods before me." And we become free of anxiety when we learn to trust our lives to the true God, not to the crowd or the coinage of the day. To the God who comes to us in Jesus and says, "Lose your life, let it go for my sake, turn it over, and you'll find it." The first commandment, you see, finally is about to question, when the crunch is on, where do you put your trust? Who or what do you finally depend on? John Claypool is an Episcopal minister down south. I haven't kept up with him, I'm not sure where. But he writes this: "It was a hot July afternoon in 1968 when the pediatrician who had cared for my little daughter all her life called me at the office, asked that I meet him at the hospital at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. When I got there, he introduced me to a hematologist. The two of them had me take a look into a microscope at a slide that had been taken from a sample of my daughter's blood earlier that afternoon. The unusual-looking cells, which even my untrained eye could detect, were identified by them as leukemic. I sat down stunned. They confirmed the fact that my little one was in the grip of a lethal disease called acute lymphatic leukemia, with all that that implied. We talked some, and then I went out by myself in the hospital lobby in a state of utter shock and disbelief. And I remember thinking, not only I don't believe I can stand to see my little one suffer this way, but also I'm not sure I can survive if she doesn't. And that was the beginning of an 18-month drama that had even worse moments in it than what I experienced that afternoon. But the truth of the matter is that this crisis did bring its own special realities with it. Looking ahead, I would say I don't think I can stand it. And looking back, I would say I don't know how we were able to survive it. But the truth is we did. And we did it because of the same reality present in these old stories. All I know is this: the Lord did provide as He promised, and coming to trust in Him is enormously encouraging to me as I face the future. See, in the last analysis, "Thou shalt have no other gods," is more than a command. It's a gift. It's the gift of someone to follow and trust, who will ease our fears over the years and who will never, never fail. Amen.